it is a tremendous honor to have Dr. North join us again. For those of you who were able to log into our conference last fall, you'll know that Dr. North spoke eloquently and humbly about what he and his colleagues in the UK were able to accomplish after the terrible mass shooting at the Dunblane Primary School in 1996. I first learned about Dr. North when I read a book, a compendium called Reducing Gun Violence in America. It was a compendium of experts who had been called together after the 2012 Sandy Hook mass shooting. The subtitle was Informing Policy with Evidence and Analysis. And I found only 3 chapters in this book that really lived up to the title and the subtitle. One of them was by Rebecca Peters from Australia, describing how Australia enacted a complete ban on all automatic and semi-automatic long guns after the Port Arthur mass shooting there in 1996. Another was a similar article by Professor Philip Alpers, who was also involved in the Australian gun control movement and has done international work on gun control. And the third was an article by Dr. North, who prefers to go by his nickname Mick, and I'll take the liberty of addressing him as Mick throughout the rest of this discussion. It was entitled Gun Control in Great Britain After the Dunblane Shootings. And it very succinctly described the circumstances of the mass shooting at the Dunblane Primary School and the reaction to it, which included the adoption of a complete ban on handguns within just 2 years. And it's only in the last paragraph that Mick revealed that his daughter, Sophie, was one of the victims. All right, well, we'll begin. And Mick, I hope it's not too painful, but I'd like to ask you to begin by reading the title and subtitle of chapter 4 of your book, Dunblane, Never Forget, and describe the events that you recount in chapter 4.
Chapter 4 is simply entitled The 13th of March, and it covers a period from the 13th of March 1996 to the 22nd of March 1996. And the subtitle is Bye, Soph, see you this evening. And they were the words that I said to my daughter Sophie when I dropped her off at a preschool kids club at about 8:30 the morning of the 13th of March. Fully expecting that at the end of the day I would collect her again from kids club, where she used to go after school had finished, and that we'd go home and we would just be having a normal evening. That, of course, is not what happened that day. 2.5 hours later, people started coming to my office at the University of Stirling, where I worked at the time, and told me about rumours that there'd been a shooting at a school in Dunblane. It's very difficult to know how you react at a time like that. The first rumour I heard suggested it was the secondary school, not the primary school where Sophie went. The next time I heard something about it, no one was clear how serious an incident it was. There were 700 pupils at that particular school. So you feel, even if there is an incident, is it going to have affected my child? But as the intensity of the rumours increased, nobody really had any clear information. A number of us decided that we had to go up to Dunblane to find out what was going on. I did try to telephone the police office in the town, but there was no answer. So the only way I could get information was to go up to the Dunblane. Somebody offered me a lift, and it was clear when we got to the city, it was about 10 minutes drive away from the university. Something very major was happening because there were police roadblocks. there were lots of reporters milling around. So obviously a lot of people knew far more than I did. Well, without going through all the details, it took another 3 or 4 hours before I learned the full details of what had happened to Sophie. Gradually, we got some idea of the numbers involved. Some of the families, we were separated into groups according to the class that our children were in. And it was first of all clear that it was Sophie's class that had been affected. And then some of the parents were taken away, and we thought perhaps they're the ones who can hear the worst news. But it turned out that they were being told their children had been injured and hospitalized. And those of us who were left waiting, gradually, one family group by one, learned that our child had been killed. And only then did I hear the numbers of victims involved, and that Sophie's teacher had also been a victim.
Thank you, Mick. And again, I know it's painful, but could you explain, as you do in the first 3 chapters, why you dropped Sophie off that morning?
I, by then, was a single parent. Sophie's mum had died 2.5 years earlier of breast cancer. And even before Barbara died, I had to get used to looking after Sophie on my own. Barbara had been quite ill during the final months of her life. So we'd become very much a very close team together. And yeah, I had become Sophie's mum and dad over that 2.5 years.
And I think people who've been following my emails know that the book Dunblane Never Forget is out of print. You can still get an electronic version, but the electronic version doesn't include the pictures in the other version. I wonder if you might just show a picture of Sophie and Barbara and you together, and then Sophie when she was 5 years old.
Can you see that? Oh, get that. And that, of course, is also on the west coast of America. We were visiting friends in Portland, Oregon. And that, I think, was taken outside their house in a suburb of Portland, somewhere that's become very special to me and still remains.
And could you show the picture of Sophie in her school sweatshirt at age 5 years old?
Here is her. I think we'd probably only just bought the sweatshirt, and this could have been taken even before she started at the school. She was only at the school for a few months. So she'd started in the August of 1995, and the Dunblane shooting occurred in March the following year.
Thanks, Mick. Again, I can't imagine how painful it is for you to see that, but it just we get so jaded, I think, to shootings in the United States that we forget, these are real human beings, and just the tremendous tragedy that's involved in all of these shootings, but particularly one of a 5-year-old child. Could you talk a little bit about the shooter, Thomas Hamilton, and how he went about the shooting?
Yes, Thomas Hamilton. It is fortunately such a long time now that I've forgotten some of the details which aren't particularly important. I'd have to look up his exact age because that has passed me by. He was in his 40s. He had, over the years, been involved with the Boy Scouts. He had to leave the Boy Scouts, but he had tried to set up boys' clubs. And this was one of the possible reasons why he became resentful towards the town of Dunblane. I mean, no one's ever going to be quite sure why he committed the crime that he did, but there had been very mixed feelings about these boys' clubs, and he had been gradually forced to close them down, certainly the ones in Dunblane. He was also a licensed gunner. He seemed to have developed an interest in guns fairly on in his life. I think he started using air rifles in his teenage years. he'd even encouraged some of these boys that he took for boys' clubs to involve themselves with shooting air weapons. But his main interest had been in real firearms. There had been another massacre in Britain in 1987, in which the perpetrator had used both semi-automatic rifle and handguns. Thomas Hamilton had owned a semi-automatic rifle at one time and had that taken away when they became banned weapons after the Hungerford massacre. But after the Hungerford massacre, the government didn't do anything about handguns. So people like Thomas Hamilton were allowed to keep a number of handguns. They could keep them at home. They could keep the ammunition at home. It seems from the history that we learnt in the inquiry that followed the shooting that he had waxed and waned in his enthusiasm for shooting, but he had certainly gone back to it in the months prior to the Dunblane shooting. And he was certainly, if you were a handgun owner, the only legitimate reason for most people to own handguns in Britain then was membership of a gun club and undertaking target shooting at the gun club. And he had gone back in the year or two before Dunblane to visiting gun clubs and doing target shooting there. So at the time of the shooting, he owned 4 handguns, 2 revolvers, 2 pistols, and many hundreds of rounds of ammunition. All of those were legal. There is no evidence whatsoever that he had any illegal weaponry of any kind at all.
And if I'm not mistaken, I recall that the police periodically had to renew a license to have a handgun, and they kept renewing his license despite this.
Yes.
Is that right?
He was known to the police for a number of reasons, some of which involved these boys' clubs and inadequate supervision of the boys' clubs. And in fact, 2 police officers over the years had recommended that his license should be revoked. He would have had to renew his license every 3 or 5 years. The time period changed a bit. But every time, despite the reservations by junior officers, the senior officers who had to sort of sign off a license renewal said it was okay for him to continue owning his guns. They said there was nothing they could do, that because he had never been charged with anything, he had only come to the police's attention, he had never been arrested for anything, that there was nothing they could do, despite one particular sergeant saying at one time that this was an unfit person to own a gun. And there's no sort of real evidence that this was followed up in any way by the senior officers.
And if I'm not mistaken, in addition to Sophie, he killed 15 other students, all in Sophie's class, are all in the 5-year-old range as Sophie's teacher, and I think wounded like 15 or 16 others. Is that right?
It was yes. There were 17 people murdered that day. 16, mostly 5-year-old. One boy was 6 years old. Their teacher, 2 other teachers were seriously injured in the gym where the main shooting took place, and another I think it was 11 other classmates were injured. 2 people came out of the gym unscathed, miraculously, but he also fired his gun at other classes, fortunately without serious injury to anybody else. He'd gone outside of the gym and fired at other classrooms. And then, of course, he shot himself.
The Queen of England made some comments a couple of days afterward. Could you summarize her comments and your reaction to them?
The Queen was visiting a new museum in Leeds, which is in the north of England, and it was the Royal Armouries Museum. I'm sure it's very good museum. But in her remarks on the opening of the museum, she chose that time to make her first comment about Dunblane. So in a speech where she was saying something about the beauty of the weaponry, examples of which were on display at the Royal Armouries Museum, she also said something about a massacre in which 16 children and their teacher had been killed. And I just felt that the juxtaposition of the two was inappropriate. I wasn't aware of this until a few days later, but to me it felt rather typical of the way in which weapons, guns in particular, have often been excused, certainly amongst the establishment in Britain. And of course, the royal family were well known for being enthusiastic about shooting deer, shooting wildlife. So, and I'd never felt comfortable with that. And that prompted me to write a statement for the press. After we lost our children, we were each given the opportunity to have a family liaison team, which included a social worker and 1 or 2 police officers. And my team have been sort of encouraging me to speak to the press, just to make a short statement. And I'd said, no, I don't want to do that. But after I heard about these remarks, I just wanted to say something. I didn't say very much. It took a few days to get it released because for some reason, the police thought it was too sensitive, because I said no more guns, no more worship of guns. So, and in doing so, I was the first parent, as far as I know, to speak out about guns after the shooting.
Thank you. By the way, I just noticed that we had people waiting in the waiting room, waiting to be admitted. I'm sorry I didn't see that before, so hopefully everybody's admitted now. Just to summarize, we're talking with Mick North, who lost his 5-year-old daughter Sophie in the mass shooting at the Dunblane Primary School in Scotland in 1996. And Mick's talked about the circumstances of the shooting, and just now about the Queen's rather inappropriate comments lauding the beauty of weapons of war within days after the shooting. And by the way, I remind everybody, if you have a question you want to ask of Mick, if you will send a chat message to Marilyn Bradford with just question, then Marilyn will recognize that and ask the question, or let me know you're waiting to ask a question. And if you have a comment, just type to Marilyn in the chat function, comma. All right. Was at the time, and would everybody please mute themselves, by the way, unless we call on you to ask a question or make a comment. We're at the time, would you describe the Cullen report, the investigation of the shooting by Lord Cullen, and your reaction to that?
Yeah. Shortly after the shooting had occurred, the UK government announced that there would be a public inquiry into what happened. And public inquiries in Britain are set up after major events, major incidents, and they usually are chaired by a senior judge. So the Cullen inquiry was set up to have Lord Cullen, a distinguished Scottish judge, in the chair. And it began surprisingly quickly, within weeks. Often public inquiries don't get started for months after an event, but this one, in some ways, caught us all by surprise. I mean, obviously, as the families, as a group of people who had not had any experience of this kind of thing before, we were feeling our way, that we were obviously going through all kinds of emotional ups and downs at the time. And suddenly we were being told there was going to be an inquiry in which we had to participate in some way or another, which would take place within a few weeks. So Lord Cullen collected both oral and written evidence. So there was public sessions which lasted for about 5 or 6 weeks, at which various witnesses were called to give evidence, not only of the events that happened on the day, but also Hamilton's previous history, his history of firearms ownership, the stories about his boys' clubs came out at the time. And then following this, Lord Cullen would then write a report and make recommendations to the government. The report appeared in October, so 6 months after the actual events, which again was a very quick in terms of public inquiries. None of the families gave evidence, but we were represented by our own team of lawyers. Other interested parties also had lawyers who would cross-examine witnesses and to some extent could call their own witnesses.
And did the Cullen report recommend any new gun control laws?
What Cullen recommended was not for a ban on any kind of weapon. He did recommend severe restrictions on how handguns could be used, that you couldn't keep them at home, various ways in which they could be disabled until they were actually going to be used for target shooting. There were also a few recommendations on other matters, school security and supervision of boys' clubs, but most of his recommendations were to do with the use and ownership of guns. However, and it is something that the gun lobby have never acknowledged, because they've always said that he didn't recommend banning handguns, but he actually said that if these measures weren't, it was felt that these measures weren't going to be appropriate, then it was quite appropriate for personal ownership of handguns to be banned. So within this, though it wasn't one of his actual recommendations, within what he said is that if this won't work, then they have to be banned. But the government at the time decided that they would go one stage further. They decided that they would implement a ban on large caliber handguns. They exempted small caliber weapons such as the ones that are used in Olympic target shooting events. So that went beyond Cullen's recommendations. All the other recommendations that he made, they accepted. We had gradually come around to the view that we wanted handguns banned completely. We were doing this as the evidence to the inquiry went on. And once we were allowed to start talking to the media, which we were advised not to do until the evidence phase of the inquiry was over, we started talking to all sorts of media, telling them this is what we wanted. At the same time, other organisations and groups had got together and were also advocating a handgun ban. We were also getting a lot of support within the media itself. Virtually all the major national newspapers in Britain were in favour of this. So when the government proposed this partial ban on handguns, there was some gratitude, not from us, but most people felt like us that this was a compromise, an unnecessary one. It didn't satisfy the gun lobby. They didn't want anything banned. It didn't satisfy us because it wasn't a complete ban, and we couldn't see why you should distinguish two types of weapon that were equally able to kill people.
And then you went, when you say we, you're describing yourself and the parents of the other Dunblane victims, is that correct?
Yeah. Well, some of us had involvement in a number of different organisations. There was the families. I mean, not just those of us who lost children, but also the families of the children who were injured. There was the widow of Gwen Mayer, the teacher who died.
Mm-hmm.
There were the teachers who survived, and largely we were able to maintain a united front on this and keep conveying the message that we wanted handguns banned. And we had a lot of different voices within that group who could do things. Some people were better at talking to tabloid newspapers, others to the sort of broadsheet newspapers, others did TV interviews. So we obviously came together for the most horrific of reasons, mm-hmm. but we were able to suddenly start functioning as a collective group that were pretty effective. It was probably the right sort of number. We didn't split into factions. Mm-hmm. But in addition to that, there were other groups. I was linked with two of them. First was the Snowdrop petition, which was set up by 3 local women who just wanted to do something. And they too were getting signatures, and these were the days when petitions involved walking around with a piece of paper and get somebody to physically sign it. They started that very quickly after the shootings, and in a way they were able to speak on our behalf when we weren't, when we were being advised not to talk to the media. So we knew what they were doing, and I knew one of them particularly well beforehand. So I had a link with them. And I was also involved in setting up an organisation, Gun Control Network. There had been no organisation before campaigning, but I got contacted by Jill Marshall Andrews, who had this idea of setting up a gun control group, and we got that up and running whilst the inquiry was going on. That worked particularly well at making contacts with politicians. So a lot of the lobbying work that had to be done later was in a way primed by some of the contacts that GCN was able to make.
Could you just explain what a snowdrop is and why the name Snowdrop Campaign?
A snowdrop is a small flower which flowers in March and flowers before anything else does in Britain, and would have been the only flower blooming at the time that the children were killed. It was a very appropriate symbol, and it worked extremely well.
Now you, as I recall, you took your petition to the Prime Minister, John Major, is that right? And or at least you took your campaign to him. And what was the Prime Minister's reaction?
The first time, in fact, the only time I met John Major, I think somebody else might have met him another time. I met him very early on, just a few weeks after Dunblane, with another petition, which I haven't mentioned, but another one which required people just to sign a piece of paper, that was run by a Scottish tabloid newspaper. They collected together over 400,000 signatures, which for a country the size of Scotland is quite something, within weeks. And they invited a group of the families to come down with them to present the petition actually to the Home Secretary. But we were also able to meet John Major at that time. 3 of us had written to John Major asking if we could see him, and it wasn't clear until we got down to London that we were going to be able to do that. It was a tense, rather difficult meeting. I mean, again, this was something rather unfamiliar to all of us, meeting with senior politicians, having to put the case, which we'd already started to put together. And John Major basically towed the line which the government, the Conservative government at the time, had decided was that, well, you know, yes, we know that a gun was involved, but really it's not a major, that guns aren't a major issue. He could have carried out this killing with something else, and we couldn't think of anything else that he would have done this with. So there wasn't at that time any meeting of minds, but I think we did start to impress on senior politicians like Prime Minister John Major, Home Secretary Michael Howard, that we were serious and we weren't going to give up.
In the United States, we've never enacted anything even close to the ban on semi-automatic long guns and the handgun ban. But the limited, for example, the limited federal assault weapons ban that was enacted in the United States back, I think it was 1994, it included a grandfather clause. Anybody who had a so-called assault weapon was allowed to keep it. Did you ever consider including a grandfather clause in the ban that you proposed, the handgun ban?
No, we just wanted the private ownership to be banned, period. And I don't remember that ever coming up, that being suggested. I think it was felt by everybody that if there was to be a ban, then the weapons would have to be handed in, and the government and the government that followed, the Labour Party government, were both prepared to pay compensation to the gun owners. There were some disputes over the level of compensation, but in large, the handover went quite relatively smoothly, especially in view of the kind of threats that some of the gun owners had been making. But most of them, I think, realised that this was not worth fighting about, and they would take the compensation. I mean, some of them tried to find alternative weapons that weren't covered by the exact wording of the handgun ban. But by and large, it was certainly successful in the way that it was done.
Now, there are some critical aspects of gun control that are missing from your book. At least there are aspects that are considered critical by the majority in the Heller decision in 2008. In Heller, in a 5-4 decision, our Supreme Court ruled that for the first time in U.S. history, that there's an individual right to own a gun unrelated to service in a well-regulated militia. And they based that decision in significant part on the 1689 English Declaration of Rights and on the English common law, which they said the founders had inherited. And therefore, there was a broad right to individual gun ownership. Why didn't you cover the 1689 Declaration of Rights or English common law in your book?
It never came up. And as you know from our recent discussions, Bill, it wasn't even brought up by even the most pro-gun lobby people, particularly in Parliament. I mean, I think you looked through Hansard, which is a record of parliamentary debates, and noted that it had only been mentioned once during all the debates, some of which were quite fierce and hostile at the time that the legislation on the handgun ban was going through. So it wasn't an issue. It was brought up, as far as I know, by one set of evidence given to Lord Cullen, one set of written evidence, and I think that was by an American pro-gun person who was in Britain at the time. So this was not seen by parliamentarians, by the majority of the UK gun lobby, as far as I can see, and certainly by ourselves as ever having been an issue.
In other words, you're saying either the British people aren't aware of their own rights, or the argument by the Heller majority that we inherited a broad right to own guns from our British ancestors is nonsense.
I would say the latter. And certainly there had been I mean, there had been reviews of firearms legislation and new legislation in the early 20th century. And again, I mean, that if there were a role for the 17th century rights, then I think whatever legislation was introduced in the 20th century overtook that.
And obviously, I knew the answer to this question before, because Mick had also referred me to one of his friends, Bob Marshall Andrews, who was a member of Parliament and who helped write the gun ban, the handgun ban, and he described the argument that 1689 English Declaration of Rights or British common law guarantees a broad right to own firearms, individual right, was he described as preposterous. And then another subject you don't, as I recall, don't even touch on is the need for a handgun in the home to, as Antonin Scalia, who wrote the majority opinion, Heller said, for defense of hearth and home. And there are more than 70 references in the 2008 Heller decision to the need for a handgun in the home to protect one's person and one's property. Why didn't you cover that topic in your book?
At the time, it was not a legitimate reason for owning a handgun. I mean, as I mentioned before, the only legitimate reason for most people to be able to own a handgun was to for target shooting at a licensed gun club. The legislation is different and still remains different in Northern Ireland, where self-defense can be used as a justification for owning a handgun, but you need special permission, I think, from the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland in order to do that. It's not just a blanket, anybody can have one to protect themselves. So there's just this one small area of the United Kingdom, and firearms laws in Northern Ireland tend to be rather different from those of the rest of the UK anyway.
Thank you. And I'll add that most other high-income democratic countries do not accept self-defense as a legitimate reason for owning a gun, except in extraordinary circumstances, recognizing that guns in our homes and communities are far more likely to kill or injure honest, law-abiding people than to protect them.
Exactly.
When was it that you first thought that your proposed handgun ban might succeed, and what do you think was the tipping point in eventually getting that legislation passed?
I think one of the main tipping points would have been the Labour Party conference in 1996, when Anne Pearson, who was one of the main Snowdrop campaigners, was invited to give a speech. We knew from either direct interaction or indirect interaction with some of the senior Labour politicians who were then in opposition, that they were gradually coming round to the idea that the handgun ban would be important. It was also clear that the Conservative government of John Major was coming towards the end of its time, and it was almost inevitable that Tony Blair would be elected as Prime Minister at the next election, which was going to happen in 1997. So in a way, one of the main things we had to do, we knew there would be probable setbacks immediately after the Cullen report came out, and we only got the partial ban. But it always felt to me, at least, that we had a likely Labour Party victory coming very soon, and that as long as we could get senior Labour politicians like Tony Blair, like his shadow Home Secretary Jack Straw, on side and committing to a handgun ban and actually making it part of the manifesto that they put forward for the next general election, then we would get there. And that's what happened.
And then once the ban was enacted, here in the United States, Charlton Heston, who was a symbolic president of the NRA at one point, was famous for raising this musket in his hand and saying, "Out of my cold, dead hand." Did the government, police, whatever, have to pull handguns out of the cold, dead hands of British citizens, or did they?
No, as I just mentioned, in the end, they turned up to hand in their weapons on time, and I don't think it was felt that there were many left in circulation. There had been all these threats, and all these suggestions by some of the Tory politicians who weren't in favour of any kind of ban, who would say, oh, well, if you have a ban, that the guns would just become illegal. There's no evidence that that happened on any large scale at all. Large numbers of handguns were handed in, and I think largely the figures match up with the number that were believed to be legally owned.
Mm-hmm. And I'll add, by the way, we had intended to bring Mick to the United States, but we couldn't because of COVID. But we did bring Rebecca Peters and Philip Alpers, and both of them said the same thing happened in Australia. There's all this bluster when the semi-automatic rifle and shotgun ban was enacted. But in the end, not only did people turn in their guns, the guns that were banned in response or in return for compensation, but another 250,000 people turned in guns that weren't banned for no compensation, just because the whole view on guns had shifted. Well, Mick, how can you describe your feelings when the ban was enacted, the feelings you had and other parents had?
I can only speak for myself. I felt relief. I didn't really feel elation. Maybe that was partly because, as I say, I sort of anticipated that it was likely to happen months in advance. But it never felt, oh, we've won a victory. It's a victory that came at a huge cost, personal cost. I sort of found myself writing in the book and saying at other times that it was as if some kind of burden is placed on the families of victims after an event like this happens. And you often feel some kind of obligation to try and do something about it. And I guess that gradually lifted. But I suppose the other thing is that I learned quite a lot about how the gun lobby operate, and that even getting a total ban was not going to be the end of the road. There would be attempts to try and find other kinds of weapons that fell outside of the current legislation. There would be attempts to lobby politicians to get the ban reversed. And that was one of the reasons why I became a member of Gun Control Network, and I'm still a member of Gun Control Network. I saw one of its prime roles as making sure that the legislation didn't get reversed, to speak up if there was any attempt. The gun lobby used the Olympic Games to say, you can't ban these handguns. And they got exemptions for Olympic shooters to practice at certain times just before the Games. They claimed falsely that Britain was going to miss out on a lot of medals as a result of no longer being pistol shooting no longer being allowed. Britain had actually won an Olympic pistol shooting medals since 1912. I mean, they've won other shooting medals, but not pistol shooting. But nevertheless, that argument seemed to go down quite well. I remember talking to a Labour Minister of Sport who was adamant that, you know, that Labour, we had gone too far, and that we should be allowing Olympic pistol shooters to practice in Britain all the time. And once you do that, thin end of the wedge, you'll have other people getting involved. So I suppose I just saw this as part of a never-ending process, and that it wasn't possible, at least the way I felt about things, just to relax and say, good, done and dusted, we've done it. We can now get on with the rest of our lives.
And as I recall from the book, others claimed that the ban would ruin their livelihoods. They were involved in selling guns, and would ruin their sport that they love dearly. And what I recall,
yes, there were some very inappropriate comments made. I mean, I understand some people were losing something that they really enjoyed doing, but they had other things they could do. I understand there were people who had invested a lot in running businesses that are related to shooting. But to claim, as at least one or two of them did, that they stood to lose more than we did, was an appalling misjudgment of where priorities should lie.
I recall your response being, they can find another sport, they can find another job. Sophie can't find another life.
Yeah. This was a tabloid newspaper only published in Scotland, the Sunday Mail.
Okay.
That collected over 400,000 signatures. The Snowdrop petition eventually collected 750,000 signatures. There was never any doubt that the majority of the public wanted to see change. That was reflected in how many of them signed these petitions. And I think one of our roles was to make sure that that degree of public support was always being conveyed to the politicians, that they were reminded of that all of the time. It was helped by the fact that so many newspapers were also supportive as well. Everybody, the politicians would be getting reminders through what they read in the newspapers as well. And of course, in those days, pre-internet, that was the way all news was being conveyed, through newspapers and radio and TV. I don't know. I mean, I've reflected on this, obviously, when I was writing the book and for the 20-odd years since then. It's hard to know. I think we had a lot of things on our side that we had no control over. It pains me to say that, because, as I said before, of the numbers of us involved, it was the right sort of number to have a cohesive campaigning group amongst the victims' families themselves. We had a weak government that was worried about public opinion, which had a general election likely to happen within a year. So they couldn't ignore public opinion. We had a new, young opposition leader who I think empathized with our situation because he had young kids.
Okay.
We also had factors like the Secretary of State for Scotland was the MP for Dunblane. The Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland lived in Dunblane. So we had those personal connections to the town as well. And I think it was up to us to make sure, in a way, we exploited all these things that were in our favour. But it's hard to know. It pains me to say, but at the time, the uniqueness of the circumstances is something that hit home very hard. Those issues were there, and they were brought up largely by the gun lobby, including by someone like our current Prime Minister, who made some nasty comments about Dunblane, for which I've never forgiven him. When he was a journalist at the time, but most people seem to grab hold of the facts straight away. That the big factor here, the main factor here, was gun ownership. And not the mental state of the perpetrator, and even his connection with Boys Club hasn't, for the most part, clouded the issue of this was a man with guns who.
Let me ask you a few more questions, Mick, and then we'll go to more questions and comments. What was in the aftermath? How many more school shootings were there? What happened to gun-related deaths and injuries overall in Britain since the 1998 ban went into effect?
In terms of school shootings, there've been nothing like Dunblane. I'm trying to think of any instance in which someone has actually been shot in the school, but certainly nothing nothing like that. In terms of mass shootings, there have really been two events. One in Cumbria, in the northwest of England, in 2010, when a man who legally owned rifles and shotguns used them to kill, I think, 10 people. And then this year, sadly, in August, again, a legal shotgun owner shot 5 people in Plymouth, in the West Country, in the west of England. There have never been any other multiple shootings, bar those. In terms of numbers, statistics are always a bit of a problem when the numbers are so low, because it doesn't take more than the events in Plymouth, for example, in which 5 people were killed, to have quite an influence on our gun homicide figures. At the moment, there have been 28 gun homicides in Great Britain this year, 2021, 28. And those are the sort of numbers that we've been seeing for the last 10, 12 years. Immediately after the handgun ban, there was, at least in England, not in Scotland, an increase in the number of gun homicides. But that was just following the pattern that had been happening. It had a lot to do with gang violence and drug crime. But that peaked in about 2004 and has started falling for the following 10, 12 years and has remained at this low level since then. So we're talking of the order of 20 or 30 homicides by gun every year in England, Wales and Scotland combined.
As compared to the United States, we have on the order of 15,000, 20,000, and including suicides, over 40,000 gun deaths a year. And an overall rate of gun deaths that's 60 times the rate in Great Britain. One last question, then we'll open up for more comments and questions from other participants. After the Sandy Hook mass shooting, you were invited to participate in this summit hosted by Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And what was your feeling in participating, particularly your interaction with the American researchers? And I think you also talked with some Sandy Hook parents, is that right? What were your experiences there?
Yes, I went to Johns Hopkins, that was less than 2 months after Sandy Hook. I think the feeling I had, which was shared by Rebecca Peters and Philip Alpers, is that, I was going to say, there was always this elephant in the room. It wasn't quite an elephant because it was always being mentioned, the Second Amendment, that most of the people there, some of whom I knew before, a lot of whose articles I've read over the years, well-meaning people, just couldn't get around this Second Amendment stumbling block. And so the proposals that they came out with at the end of the meeting were not ones that Rebecca, Philip and I could really support. I mean, we were certainly listened to, but I get the feeling that a lot of people were thinking, well, we just can't do this in America. We admire what you did, but it's not possible here.
Been over 200 cases in which the Supreme Court reversed itself. And then we can talk more about how we need to reverse the Heller decision a little later on. Are there other questions or comments specifically for Mick? If not, Mick, do you have any final words of wisdom for us, and with the knowledge that we have discussed that the Second Amendment really, the Heller decision is a fraud, and there was no Second Amendment obstacle to the adoption of gun control laws comparable to ones you talked about prior to 2008 in our country. So we need to address that for sure. But Second Amendment aside,
well, obviously, I want to encourage people like you as much as it's possible to. I think I started out when I was first asked to make comments about America when there was school shootings in Mississippi and Arkansas in the late 1990s. I feel now that the things I said was rather naive. Once they see what we did in Dunblane, the Americans all want to change. And I think I felt that all the way through to maybe the end of 2000, having gone to the Million Mile March in Washington in 2000. I thought that, there is a movement here. It did seem to have changed quite abruptly when Bush got in. And I keep looking for positive signs, and certainly talking to you and others does allow me to have some positivity. As time goes on, it's more difficult to see how things we did in Dunblane could apply exactly to America, because that chance seems to have been and gone. Sandy Hook would have been the time when we could have seen something happen on the lines of Dunblane. And the fact that it didn't is very, very disappointing. But you'll know better than me, but I like to think that local initiatives can be gradually built up. As far as how you deal with the Supreme Court, well, I have to admire you for what you're doing at the moment, and just hope that something can come of that. But I know what you're up against.
All right. Well, again, Mick, I can't thank you enough. Particularly, I hope it's not too painful for you to go over the details of the murder of your daughter and the other children and the teacher. But I hope you find some solace in satisfaction in the enormous achievement that you and your fellow Dunblane parents and other members of the Gun Control Network and the Snowdrop Campaign, your achievement and the countless lives that you saved in your country, and also the inspiration that you provide to us. When I get frustrated and discouraged and everything, I keep thinking of what you did under the most difficult circumstances, and say, if you can do what you did, we can certainly.
You will have my continued and ongoing support.
Well, I appreciate it very much, and we eventually will succeed in following your example and ending the shameful epidemic of gun violence in our country. So at this time, if you're welcome to stay on if you like, but we've used probably more of your time than we should, and I know you've got other
it's always a pleasure,
pleasurable thing to do. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you everybody else for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mick. Thank you so much.
Thank you.